In this video, we're going to be discussing the Mittler Rebbe, the second Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Dovber Schneuri of Lubavitch. He was born in the year 1773 and he passed away in the year 1827. He was born less than a year after the passing, of the Maggid of Mezrich, whose name was Dovber, and the Maggid had told Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, who we discussed in our previous video, that he was going to have a son, he should name him after him. And he did, and he named him Dovber. He was a very gifted child. He was the oldest boy. I don't think he was the oldest of the Alter Rebbe's children, but he was the oldest boy. At that point, he had a couple daughters, I believe. He had, like I said, he was very ill as a child. There's a story that when he was very young, he once, the Alter Rebbe, who used to read the Torah every Shabbos, was not in town, or Rabbi Dovber was out of town for whatever reason, and he heard someone else read the Tochacha, the curses that happen to the Jewish people if they don't do the mitzvahs, in Parshas Kisavo, which is read traditionally a couple weeks before Rosh Hashanah. And he heard someone else read it, and he heard such terrible things being read in the Torah, such terrible curses that will befall the Jewish people, that he fainted, and he became gravely ill, to the point that the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, was not sure if his son could fast on Yom Kippur. As we know, Jewish law says that if a person cannot physically fast on Yom Kippur, he is exempt. There's different ways. How do you go about that? Consult your local rabbi. But he was debating this amongst himself, as he himself, as we discussed previously, was a great halachic authority. He was trying to see if his son could fast Yom Kippur. He became so ill. He was so sensitive to this. So everyone asked him, "Don't you hear these curses read every year?" And he said, "When my father reads, I hear no curses." He was extremely dedicated to his father's mission of teaching Chassidus and spreading the Chassidic teachings. He wanted to hear Chassidus at all costs, all the time. He always wanted to hear his father say more Chassidic teachings and more Chassidic explanations. Eventually, when he was proposed marriage, he married at the age of 16, which was common back then, probably even a little older maybe than his father had married at the age of 14. He said, "I'll take whichever shidduch, whichever match comes to fruition quicker." Why? Because he knew that when they would have the wedding, his father would say Hasidic discourses as part of the marriage celebration, and he wanted to hear those discourses as soon as he can. He was extremely learned and very into his learning, and very dedicated to his learning, to the point, there's a story that when he was a young man, he was studying in the floor that was below his father's, and he was so engrossed in his learning, he didn't hear that in the room he was studying in, his child had fallen out of the crib and was crying. Rabbi Shneur Zalman comes running down the stairs. He hears a child crying, and he soothes the child, puts him back. And meanwhile, Rabbi Dovber has no clue what's going on, and he decides that Rabbi Shneur Zalman decides to leave him, and says, later calls him into his room, and he says, "You should know what happened." And he said, "When Torah study can never come at the expense of a Jewish child. A Jewish child is crying, that takes all precedence." Tremendous lesson for all of us. He also, during his father's lifetime, his father told him that he should himself start saying Hasidic discourses. So what he would do is he would repeat his father's discourses, but he would repeat it with great length. Rabbi Shneur Zalman, in the earlier years of his leadership, would say very, very short discourses. Later on, he said longer ones, but it never really was that long. I don't have a time of how long, but there are some one-liners that are written down from the earlier years. Later, the discourses get to be about a page or two, and they're not very long. Rabbi Dovber started to say very lengthy ones, and his father encouraged him that this is his style and this is his way of teaching, and therefore he should continue to do that. And he instructed other Hasidim and other of his students not to repeat the Hasidic discourses except word for word from what he had said. So Rabbi Dovber was clearly given instructions that were different than the other students. He eventually he had a family of 10 children, um, many sons and many daughters. Some of his famous children include his son-in-law, his daughter married his son-in-law. Chaya Mushka married his nephew Menachem Mendel, who ends up being his successor, the Tzemach Tzedek. So that was one of his daughters. Another one, famously, Rebbe Menucha Rachel. We'll talk about in a second. Who ends up moving to Israel, and he had a son, Reb Menachem Nachum, who did not want to be a Hasidic Rebbe, and he therefore moved to his father's resting place and did not succeed him. So let's go back to his life during his father's lifetime. Besides saying Hasidic discourses, he was also instructed to be the guiding the Hasidim. So, in other words, the Rebbe's job is to kind of give the Rebbe cannot necessarily give individual guidance to every single person on a micro level. So he gives general instructions, maybe even specific general instructions to a specific person. But the day to day of getting through all these different service of God, of refining oneself, studying, prayer, etc. This was given to him. He was given this job to guide the younger Hasidim specifically. Included with that was his best friend at the time, Reb Aaron Halevi of Strashela, who later also opened the Hasidic court, as we'll mention shortly. And they together were like one unit. They would guide the Hasidim, specifically the younger generation. And one time they were seen walking together, and they said, somebody mentioned to the Rabbi Shneur Zalman, "Look, these are two friends that don't come apart." And he said, "Halavai, I wish." And as we'll see later, they did have a falling out. Now, after in 1812, Rabbi Shneur Zalman and his entire family fled from Napoleon, as we discussed previously. They fled from Napoleon's invasion of Russia, and they moved east, away from the invasion. Napoleon was also heading east, and they were literally at some points, maybe a few hundred yards, running away from the front. And somehow, miraculously, they got past Moscow, and then Napoleon eventually retreats out of Russia. Once they got past Moscow, the entire area of Western, I guess you could say, Western Russia was totally destroyed, and they decided that in Eastern Russia there were no Jews, there were no Jewish communities, so they decided to start heading south to where there were some Jewish communities. Specifically, they were heading to this community of Kremenchuk, and eventually, which is more south. So they start heading down there, and the Rabbi Dovber ends up going ahead to find lodging for them in Kremenchuk, where they thought they would spend a few months, maybe even years, until they could figure out how to get back to White Russia. And he is, therefore, because he went ahead, he was not there when Rabbi Shneur Zalman passed away in that eastern part of Russia, southeastern part of Russia. He was a few hundred miles ahead of them. I'm not exactly sure the mileage, but I believe it was around that. Ahead of them in Kremenchuk. When they come to him and they tell him that his father had passed away, he fainted. And they revived him. And again, he realized that his father had passed away, and he fainted again. And the doctor started to get concerned that perhaps he wouldn't wake up. And they woke him up. They said, no, he didn't really pass away. He's very ill. And then eventually they broke the news to him slowly that he passed away. And again, he fainted. And this happened multiple times. And the doctors were getting concerned. And what they decided was, when he would wake up, they put a box of manuscripts, Hasidic manuscripts. They put them out there in front of him, and he wakes up and he sees the manuscripts, and he says, "Okay, we have what to live for." And he becomes the successor to his father, and he becomes later. At that time, he was known as the Rebbe, as the Hasidic master. And after his lifetime, he gets the name the Mittler Rebbe, which we'll explain that the Alter Rebbe means the old rabbi, the Mittler Rebbe means the middle rabbi, and the Tzemach Tzedek, his successor, his son-in-law and successor, heard his Hasidim referring to the previous Rebbe as the Frierdiker Rebbe, which means the previous Rebbe, and his grandfather was the Alter Rebbe, was the old rabbi, and he didn't like the word Frierdiker, which means previous. Like it means like he was in the past. So he's, in his view, a Rebbe is forever. So therefore, he asked that they should call him the Mittler Rebbe, and that's how he got that name. And that's the name we'll use for now. So the Mittler Rebbe right away gets on to first of all raising funds. He needed to raise funds for two things. Number one, his family. His family had left Liadi, which was the city they were living in. They had many family members. I think about 60 family members. Again, this is the Rabbi Schneuri Zalman, the Alter Rebbe's children and grandchildren, great grandchildren, and they all needed homes. All their homes have been burned by Napoleon or by Russian or soldiers, however, whichever one. I believe it was by Napoleon. I think actually the Alter Rebbe's home himself that he burned himself. He didn't want Napoleon to get it, and basically there was nothing left, and they didn't know how they were going to do it, and also Russia was in economic shambles. I saw a letter where the Mittler Rebbe writes that there was 300% inflation in Russia at that time because of the war. Even though they vanquished Napoleon, the devastation was enormous. They had burned half of Russia to the ground, the Russians themselves, as we all know. And specifically, the area where Napoleon invaded was in the Pale of Settlement, where the Jews lived. So it was very, very difficult for the Jewish community. Somehow he raised money. He raised enough money for his family, and he raised enough money for. Also, he started raising money for the community, for the Jewish community who needed a lot of help. So he was in that southern part of Russia, and they had a little bit of money, and he was able to raise something, a nice amount of money. And there's actually letters, which we'll talk about later, of how he distributed the money. And basically, what ended up happening is he eventually he decides he's going to move back to that part of Russia, the Pale of Settlement, the Belarus, and he decides to pick the city Lubavitch, and that is how the name Chabad Lubavitch is born. So Chabad is the type of Hasidus. It's, as we'll discuss in a second, and Lubavitch is the city where it was there, and Lubavitch was the seat of the Chabad Rebbes for 102 years. And that name stuck after that, even once the fifth Lubavitch Rebbe left Lubavitch fleeing from the Germans. The name Lubavitch Rebbe stuck until this day. The next thing he started doing after he moved to Lubavitch, he built a court, he built up houses for his family, distributed the funds. He started to print his father's teachings. He printed a siddur with explanations, Hasidic discourses on the siddur. He printed the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law that his father authored. And then he started printing other Hasidic discourses that were his kind of, as we explained earlier, his expanded versions of those. And eventually he started printing his own Hasidic discourses. And again, we mentioned that tremendous poverty of the Jewish community at that time. And because of that, he actually decided he was going to let the Hasidim print individual discourses in a book. And he said, okay, you could just buy one. You don't have to buy the whole book because, for a few cents, you could buy one discourse instead of a few dollars. I'm using, obviously, American denominations, but you understand the idea. And this way, they were able to afford. And he realized that he was the biggest bottleneck to Hasidic teachings. All the Hasidic teachings he understood. And now he has to teach them. And so number one is he started printing. He printed tremendous amount of booklets and books of his own teachings. And uniquely, he did not ask for endorsements of his book. At that time in the Jewish community, it was very common to, including his father, got an endorsement for his book, the Tanya. But he said, this is my father's teachings. I'm not deviating from them at all. And my father's teachings do not need any approbations or, endorsements. And he printed a tremendous amount, as much as he could. Again, even printing, individual papers, etc., that people could buy. Another thing that he did was, and he said that he was going to start to travel to southern Russia, Ukraine, in that area. And he realized that not everybody could travel, especially during that time of very economic hardship, that not just the expenses of travel, but the expenses of leaving work for, a few weeks or months to travel to Lubavitch. And therefore, and in order to hear Hasidic teachings, therefore he said, I'm going to go around and start and travel. So that way they could come to an area and they, all the local towns could come visit. It'll take a lot less time and money to, but even though he himself was at ill health, he felt it was necessary until he could not. So he did that as well. Another thing that he was involved with was helping the Jews in Israel, as his father did. Specifically, he suggested making pushkas, charity boxes. And until then, it was not a common practice. And he basically said, okay, what you're going to do is you're going to make a pledge in the beginning of the year, based on your ability, and then you're going to put in every single day or every single week. You're going to put into this pushka. You're going to put into this box. You're going to put in a few coins, and then when that way, when the collectors, the tzedakah collector for Israel, would come to your area, you didn't have to where's my money? I made a pledge. It's not available yet. This way, everything's available very quickly. You have the box sitting in your house. You give it to the collector. And he could go on to his way and continue to Israel. Until to this day, tzedakah pushkas tzedakah boxes are very, very common and wonderful way to give charity. He also made farming colonies in the Kherson region of Ukraine. And again, he himself traveled there once or twice, and later he ended up sending messengers to go to these areas and to teach Hasidus to them. And again, these were special permits for Jews to own land in Russia, which was not so easy. And he managed to do that. And because of the economic boost that this gave, the czars eventually gave him a special document that he was an honorable citizen for generations, and this way protecting him and his family, though it did not necessarily help, as we'll see in a second. Let's talk a little bit about his court. One thing that was unique was that he had a very, very royal court. He himself was a very regal person. People would stop and look at him. He wore white clothing on Shabbos, very regal. And another thing he had was a choir, a kapella in Yiddish or Russian. And this choir, he also had part of it was there were horses that would perform part of this choir. And till this day, there are songs that are attributed to his choir that they composed that was sung in front of him. Very regal court idea. Another regal part of his court was on Lag BaOmer, the day that celebrates the passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and the founder of the author of the Zohar and the founder of Kabbalistic teachings as we know them today. He would go out to the fields, and they would have this tremendous feast, and it was a tremendous sight. And eventually, he became known as a very regal figure, and eventually the government became a little jealous as that. We'll see in one moment. Let's talk a little bit about his opposition. Number one is he had a competition from his best friend, Rabbi Aaron Halevi of Strashela, as we mentioned earlier. After the passing of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Dovber became the Rebbe as per his father's request. The Rabbi Pinchas Reizes was a confidant, a close chassid of the Alter Rebbe, and he was told specifically that only Rabbi Dovber should be his successor, no one else. And further, so some Hasidim took it very seriously, and some Hasidim said there is no Rebbe at all, and some Hasidim joined Rabbi Aaron Halevi of Strashela, and he had also had a falling out with the Alter Rebbe and Rabbi Dovber during the Alter Rebbe's lifetime. Apparently, he was going against the Alter Rebbe by saying Hasidic teachings, his own Hasidic teachings, which was against the Alter Rebbe's wishes. Only Rabbi Dovber had permission to do that, as we mentioned earlier, and he ended up leaving the court of the Alter Rebbe, and a lot of things changed in those last few years of his life, of really solidifying the Chabad way of teaching Hasidus. And because of that, Reb Aaron Halevi ends up opening a Hasidic court in Strashela, and this court ended up being more in the Polish style of Hasidus, which is much more about emotions, and also about that everything is just you have to follow the Rebbe, and the Rebbe kind of you live vicariously through the Rebbe. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the idea, and holding on to the Rebbe's coattails is probably a better way to say it. And this is not the Chabad way, but he ended up teaching, his Chassidus ended up leading to that. In response to this, Rabbi Dovber ends up writing a book called Kuntres HaSpilus, the book of, I don't know how you say it exactly in English, but essentially how to properly control your emotions. Rabbi Dovber was the opposite. He had no emotional outbursts at all. In fact, when he would pray, he would not move a muscle. Compared to his father, the Alter Rebbe would move so violently they actually had to put padding up in the synagogue where he would sometimes hit the walls. But at the same time, sometimes he would pray with such intense devotion that his entire clothing would become drenched, and even the tip of his shtreimel would become drenched. So obviously he was going through a lot of emotion. He prayed with passion, but it wasn't visible. It was real. It was eternal. And essentially, what he was trying to teach with this book was how do you have emotions? Not that the external affects your internal, but the internal affects the external. Essentially, so having an emotional outburst is okay if it's your real emotions, not just you're just outwardly emotional. At any rate, beyond the scope of this video, he was extremely dedicated to the Hasidim and to his Hasidim, and even his Hasidim who had left him from Rabbi Aaron Halevi, he ends up letting them back in. Another very important thing that he dealt with was the Misnagdim. As we discussed previously, the opposition of Hasidus ended up putting Rabbi Schneuri Zalman into jail twice, and it was very, very bad at that time. But in the Mittler Rebbe, in his time, he decided that he's gonna end this. This is too much. The Jewish people are split. God forbid. This is not good. So what he did is first of all, he told his Hasidim, you are not to engage with the Misnagdim, with the opposition at all. If they invite you to their synagogue to pray, you pray outside. You don't if they're going to engage with you in conversation about Hasidus. And he basically made it impossible for them. And if you didn't follow these rules, you weren't allowed to come to Lubavitch and be part of the Hasidic court. So the rules were very strict, and he had people who would keep track to make sure the Hasidim were following the rules. So in that way, he got it down. And also, the Jewish people had a new enemy, which was, number one, obviously the hard times that the Jewish people were going through with the government, as we'll see later, and also with the inflation and economic turmoil based on the Napoleonic invasion, and the Haskalah movement, the Enlightenment movement, which was trying to really uproot traditional Judaism. So based on all these different things, they realized they had a common enemy, and they started working together. And Rabbi Dovber, the Mittler Rebbe, worked hand in hand with Chaim of Volozhin, the successor to the Vilna Gaon, and also with other leaders of the quote-unquote opposition to Hasidus. And really, the whole opposition died down, and it really went away. The last thing we'll talk about as far as opposition was his arrest. He was arrested in the year 1825, and he was released in the year 1826, and he passed away in the year 1827. The reason why that's relevant is because basically two people conspired together to extort him. It was basically extortion. What happened was one of his relatives from his mother's side of his family, who had actually been a friend of his, later decided that he wanted to extort. He heard that they had raised a lot of money in order to distribute to relatives, and he wanted some money, and he refused. He said, the money wasn't given for this purpose. This is charity, and therefore I have to distribute it as and he had people who helped him. He didn't do it on his own, and we have to distribute it appropriately. That was one thing. And then another thing was that we mentioned Rabbi Pinchas Raises, we mentioned previously as being the one who told the Hasidim that the true successor is Rabbi Dovber. He passed away without children. He was an extremely wealthy man. He was also involved in this distribution of money. And basically, these people were waiting their whole lives that he would pass away, and they're going to get all his money. He was extremely wealthy, and all the thing they found was receipts. He had given every penny away to charity, specifically through Rabbi Dovber and through his father, Rabbi Schneuri Zalman. And they were furious. And they extorted him, and they said, listen, you have to give us something. And he said, I can't give you anything. This is charity. I can't just, give. If it was money given to me personally, I would be happy to, make a settlement. But this is charity money. I have to give it to the people who it was, intended for, whether it's in Israel or locally here. And they were furious, and they found in his possessions, they found a letter, and this letter said that basically that the Mittler Rebbe had raised about 35,000 rubles, which was and a quarter had been distributed. And what they mistranslated it to be from Hebrew, they mistranslated it to mean that not even a mistranslation, but a misinterpretation. Really, it was translated accurately. But if you could read it both ways. Instead, they said we have 35,000 rubles, which is a quarter of what we essentially a quarter, and we have a quarter we have distributed. And basically, they said that it's only a quarter of what we have essentially, which would mean they had 100,000 rubles, over 100,000 rubles, which was a tremendous amount of money. It would have meant that he was stealing bread away from his followers. It would have meant that it was just an impossible sum at that time in Russia, as we mentioned. And basically, they went to the government and they said, "You see, this man is a liar and a thief, and he must be extorting people. He must be putting on taxes, which was illegal. For someone to put on taxes on a community, which was again all lies. It was just extortion." And eventually, this was found to be totally false. However, the government then got very interested in his regal court, and basically, eventually, it went to the Senate in Moscow, and the Senate, basically eventually investigated it, and they said that he had done nothing wrong, and that whole thing ended in 1827. About a couple weeks after he had passed away, the Senate finally basically said he was fine, but it was too late, Rebbe. Even though he had been released from prison, which again, that imprisonment was not such a severe imprisonment; it was more house arrest. But at any rate, he eventually was cleared, but he already passed away. So that is basically the story, and so these were the different oppositions he had. In a way, he was very aloof from the world, it seemed. There's a story that after Rabbi Dovber passed away, and his son-in-law and successor, the Tzemach Tzedek, used the same wagon driver, who was a non-Jew, and he asked him how much it cost for the ride, and he said of whatever the amount was, and the Tzemach Tzedek Rabbi Mendel gave him the money, and he gets some change back, and he asked for the change, and he said, "You're a fake rabbi," and he told all the Chassidim, "You're fake." He said, "Why? Why is he fake?" He said, "The previous Rebbe, Rabbi Dovber, he would reach into his pocket, give me whatever it was. It could be gold coins, silver coins. He had no idea what money was. He didn't really understand it," which, as we see, wasn't necessarily really true. He understood the value of charity money, but his own personal money, he wasn't really interested in, like the minutiae of it. He seemed aloof from the world, but at the same time, he related deeply to his Hasidim, and he understood their issues. He understood their personal flaws. Some of them were deeply flawed people, and he understood and had to guide them. So, and really, the Hasidim kind of brought it out of him that naturally, yes, he was a very aloof person, but he understood that in order to be a Hasidic Rebbe, you have to understand your Hasidim, and he was willing to overcome, so to speak, these, overcome his aloofness in order to be involved and engage with his flock. Lastly, we'll talk about his passing. He passed away in the city of Niezhin. He was actually visiting his father's grave in Hadich. And he said that basically there was going to be a new decree, which was decreed by Nikolai, who was the new czar at the time, that Jewish children were going to be kidnapped and taken to 25 years of army service, which was terrible decree. And maybe for another video we could discuss in depth. But it was Jews against Jews, and these Jewish children being ripped from their families and being physically beaten and murdered, and even when they got out, they were ignorant of their Jewish faith. It was a very, very terrible decree that lasted for a long time in Russia. And he said, "I can't handle this." And he went to his father's grave in Hadich, as we mentioned, in southeastern part of Russia. And he came out and he said, "My father took away the rabbinate from me, essentially." And people thought that meant he was moving to Israel, that he was, just like, "Hey, I'm out of here." But eventually he continued traveling home, and eventually he passed away on the way back in the city of Niezhin. For many days he was saying Chassidus, and he was saying tremendous amounts of Chassidus from essentially his deathbed. And at some point he passed. He was said he's going to say new secrets that he never said before, and Chassidim were pushing to hear what he's going to say, and someone's hat fell off. It fell on him. And he said, "Okay, it's a sign from God. I'm not supposed to reveal it." And he said other Hasidic discourses, and eventually, in middle of the discourses, he stopped talking, and the Hasidim were scared; they didn't know what to do, and they started to bang and bang and bang and make noise, see that what and eventually he gets out of his reverie, whatever it was, and he says, and they said, Rebbe, did you hear us? And he said, yes, I heard in heaven. What is such a high neshama? What is such a high soul doing in such a lowly world? And eventually he continued saying Chassidus, and the doctors actually had originally, before this happened, they asked him to not say Chassidus. They thought it was bad for his health, and actually he ended up deteriorating. And when they allowed him to say Chassidus, he just started talking, and he just wanted to share. And eventually, in the middle of saying Chassidus, he said he said this verse about life. Chaim means life, and with the word life, he stopped talking, and they realized that he had passed away. And he was buried there in Niezhin, in that today I believe it's in Ukraine, southeastern part of the Russian Empire. And his legacy really, besides his writings and his teachings and all that, is really that he, first of all, he made Chabad Lubavitch. He settled Lubavitch. He guided his Chassidim through turbulent times, and even more so, he really defined what Chabad Chassidus is all about. Chabad Chassidus is about understanding Chassidic teachings, deep ideas, implementing them into and understanding them and implementing them into your prayer, into your service of God. It's a very intensive work, and his father had been misunderstood by his colleagues, by the opposition of the Misnagdim, and as well as even his own Hasidim, as we see that none of them really understood how are they going to translate that into the masses, into everybody being able to not just people who are big intellectuals or big pious people, but even regular people. How are they going to do this? They thought that maybe this is for elite students, not for everybody. And Rabbi Dovber really showed how implemented that this is for every single Jew. Chassidus, and could be understood by everybody. It could be through his lengthy explanations, made it accessible to everybody, and made everybody able to apply it through prayer and service of God. So that is his real legacy, is really solidifying Chabad as Chabad, which is intellectual Hasidic ideas, and making this not just that we say some nice words and we get excited, but that really understanding every Jew has to do this. And that was that's really his legacy in the Chabad community until this day. Just the last thing, we didn't say it before. His last name was Schneuri. His last name was in memory of his father. When the Russian government made that all Jews have to have last names, he chose the name Schneuri, which means of Schneer. His father's name was Schneer Zalman, the Alter Rebbe. Later, the rest of the family took the name Schneer son, which means son of Schneer in Russian, versus Schneuri is more Hebrew. However, many letters he does sign the name Schneer, just like that, and also Schneerov, which seems to be like the Russian meaning son of. So it's not clear exactly, but it seems that the tradition is that his last name was Schneuri. I know this one went a little longer. We had a lot to speak about. We could speak a lot more. I'll just leave off with, they said that his whole life was dedicated to the teachings of Chassidus, and that if he would cut his finger, blood would not flow, Chassidus would flow. I think that's an apropos way to end this one off. Thank you very much for joining. If you have any questions, comments, something I could have said, should have said, if I made a mistake, please put it in the comments. We love to hear feedback, and we will see you in the next video.